Again, thanks for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange. Through Alumni Exchange, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape with the everyday with a community of UIC faculty, staff, and alumni experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and the greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to get our program started this afternoon, featuring UIC professor and the head of the Department of Communications, Zizi Papakarisi, as she will talk about the trust deficit as she leads us through a discussion on social and political consequences of online media. We are excited for this conversation. Thank you, Professor Papakarisi, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me over. Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here. I see some familiar faces. I hope that we can have an interesting conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between news, social media, politics, democracy, and everyday life, and the things that sort of come together to create a so-called trust deficit. I'm also going to prevent my PowerPoint presentation from auto-advancing itself at the same time. I'd like to talk a little bit about what it is I do and how I became interested in this area. So I study the social and political consequences of the internet. So what this generally means is that I conduct studies that examine whether the internet and many of the platforms that it supports are good or bad for you, whether they make you more or less social, whether they invite behaviors that are more or less toxic, and generally speaking, what do they do for society, what they do for politics, and what they do for democracy. I've been studying the internet since the previous century. I can now proudly say, and I get a kick out of saying that, I started looking at the internet in the early 90s when it was a very different medium. And I see at least one person in the audience who was studying the internet at that time before me, whose work I used often. I spotted Steve Jones coming in. When I started looking at the internet, it was a very different medium. We had about 5% of the US population employing it, mostly people in universities, and less than 1% worldwide with access to it. So not only were we looking at something very different, but people were actually much, much more puzzled by it than they are now, and they still are. My background is in order to study the internet, the sort of background that I had to get focused on communication and political science and social psychology, because I wanted to understand what this medium was all about and what sort of possibilities it presented for all of us, why it mattered. I remember at the time being close to graduation, a doctoral student, and interviewing for jobs, and going to interviews to get a tenure track position with the university, and being asked, why is this important? Why does it matter? Is it going to exist in the next few years? And I would say things like, well, in the next few years, this medium is going to be as ubiquitous as electricity. It's going to feel as normal to use it as it is, walking into a room and turning the lights on. And people would laugh at me. This was in the year 2000. And then they would point at their print newspapers, because so many of them would come to the interview, and part of their morning commute was and still is to read the newspaper. And they would wave that at me and say, I'm never going to give this habit up. I'm always going to be reading this newspaper. And I would say, well, possibly, yes, but that too is going to be changing. Journalism will still be around, but it'll take on a different form. And it's quite possible you're not going to be reading that newspaper or that in its paper form. And again, I would get laughter. And then of course my favorite part was when I was asked about Amazon, because I came from Austin. I completed my PhD studies in Austin. It was a very techie town, so I was asked about Amazon a lot. And then I would be told that Amazon is not going to last, and I would respond, well, just give it a chance, because all they need is just more distribution centers that are better connected. And of course, look where we are, 20 years later. I'm not some kind of oracle, a social scientist. We are not that, although I am amazed by my bravado at that young age, and my and the fact that I would make these grand statements. I think I was motivated by the ignorance that sometimes, the of consequence that motivates us when we're young. I'm glad I got into this field as early as I did, because it gave me the opportunity to study things as they were unfolding. And it actually places me in the position to have conversations like the one I'm going to have with you every day. And they're very interesting conversations. Looking at the internet and the many platforms that it supports allows me to study everyday things that are fun, and it makes my job feel like a hobby. So I will be talking about what this trust deficit is and how it came to be. And also I'll be making some tips on how we can begin to sort of cultivate and pave the way towards a more healthy news media diet. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the basics, and share with you in very simple terms what it is that the news does and does not do, what the internet will and will not offer you, because it cannot do that, and then also how social media can and cannot benefit you. And I'll start with this in the beginning. I'm going to start by talking about some things that are very common in all democracies today and have been common for some time. They really characterize how we think, how we react, how we behave. And I will do that because in order to understand what we look for and how we act, we need to understand what it is that we are reacting to, and what it is that we are looking for, our motivation, where we're coming from, our hopes, our aspirations, our dreams, and our deepest fears and insecurities at the same time. And so many people are fascinated by online media and have been fascinated for a long time because they promise change, right? They just imply, they promise, they suggest empowerment. And the need for empowerment is especially pronounced in contemporary democracies because there's a sense that we are living in an era that is civically deprived. Okay, there's a lot of nostalgia for past forms of civic engagement. There's a sense that sometime in our collective past, we experienced perfect democracy. We had it within our grasp, and now we don't. And we're looking for it, and we're hoping that somehow resurrect it through these technologies and through other means. But we are definitely longing for something that we think we had and that we lost. And what I'm here to tell you is that we've actually never, ever had perfect democracy. We've always had democracies that created some problems with us and also provided some answers for us as well. Another attribute, another condition that's very prevalent in contemporary democracies has to do with a number of limitations to civic involvement that are presented by the representative democracy model, which is pretty ubiquitous in terms of how we practice democracy, how we use democracy to govern. And so this idealized notion of democracy that we have in our heads is based around this micro-governance model that really only existed in some very basic and really slightly flawed form in the ancient days. We've always used some kind of representation in democracy in the sense that we elect representatives that then make important decisions for us. And as societies scale, as they become more mass, this ends up leaving us disillusioned, disenchanted with the promise, with the potential of democracy, and then how we can be involved in democratic governance. We vote. That ends up being about it. People want more. In the past few years, for instance, pre the COVID era, I had the opportunity for my latest project and my latest book titled After Democracy to travel the world and have conversations with strangers. So I ended up interviewing people from the US and the UK, Mexico and Brazil, Germany, Greece, Canada, and I also visited refugee centers and spoke with people who had fled their countries and came from Libya and Syria and Afghanistan, Egypt, Tunisia, just to name a few. And I asked them all the same three questions. What is democracy? What does it mean to be a citizen? And what might make democracy better? It was a fascinating journey. It was also a very humbling journey because I talked with people from all walks of life, and it was especially humbling when I spoke with people who had fled their countries with nothing but the clothes on their back because they wanted to avoid being recruited by the Taliban. So it was a fascinating journey, and I learned many things. And people told me their stories and many different things, and a lot of the things that they said were similar, but they used different words to express them. But something that almost all of my conversational companions told me was that they longed for greater participation, for the opportunity to have greater input, just a more audible voice in governance. They talked about how fulfilling it was to participate in forms of micro governance, and how the general practice of voting left them disillusioned, dissatisfied. They felt like they were often given inadequate options to choose from. Which brings me to my next point, another condition plaguing contemporary democracies. And I think the good news is that we've caught wind of that, because I've been talking about the problems of polling for a very long time, for nearly as long as I've been studying the internet. But I'm finally glad that we've started as a society to reject polling as an accurate reflection of public opinion. So in contemporary democracies, we have been for a very long time, for decades, been relying on polling to understand or to get a sense for the sentiment of the public. That's a deeply inaccurate practice. With polling and similar forms of, aggregating public opinion, what ends up happening is that we take personal, subjective, nuanced opinions and we reduce them to yes or no responses to prescribed questions, to questions that have been predetermined, predefined by others. And I think about it this way, how many questions in your life are you able to answer with a yes or no answer response? Very few, are you going to the grocery store? Yes. But then again, maybe. I don't know. If there's traffic, I might change my mind. It depends. And yet, this is what we're asked to do time and time again. And on increasingly important civic matters that determine our civic future, determine our future in general. So polling misrepresents. I think we've finally come to understand that, especially in the past couple election cycles. Um, and it misinforms. And of course, we no longer trust polls, they are broken. But this whole process of trusting them and then learning to distrust them has cultivated a growing sense of skepticism and cynicism and just a little bit of, disinterest and apathy towards democracy, which then connects to the next point: declining civic participation through formal channels of political involvement. Fewer and fewer people vote. Um, a lot of people say it's because of apathy. I disagree. I tend to find in my work that it's because they're not satisfied with the choices that they're being given, and also because they tend to feel like they are being counted, but they don't feel like they count, like their opinions actually count. So what many interpret as apathy or lack of participation, lack of interest, I think is more reasonably explained as the fact that the right to vote no longer means what it used to. And finally, all of the above practices generate cynicism. We have a cynical public. For some part of the population to be cynical is an ideological position. It's even chic a little bit. Um, but I would also argue that to a certain extent, for democracies and for people who have had the experiences that we've had with democracy, it's normal to be cynical and it's normal to be skeptical. And I'll draw a tiny distinction between skepticism and cynicism here. I think the more you learn, the more skeptical you become. You have more knowledge, you have more information, a greater understanding of the world around you. So it's normal to be skeptical. Cynicism is also to be expected. It's not exactly the same as skepticism. It's filled with a little bit, with just a little bit more poignancy, uh, disappointment, disillusionment, um, and distrust. We distrust many, many things, and primarily we distrust the news. We have been distrusting the news for a long time, and let me talk a little bit about why that is. So the primary reason why we end up being distrustful of the news is because news tells stories about events. It does not replay events in real time in the sequence that they happened. It cannot do that. And we know this. Can we trust news ever? Never entirely, but we can learn to read it. We can learn to understand it better. News works by turning events into particular stories, and it does so by utilizing news values. News values are the things that turn events into stories. So there is one event, and there's a number of different stories that are being broadcast or told about it, depending on the particular channel or platform that you're using to tune into that certain event. I've presented here a number of ways in which news values work. And I do this to give you a sense of how they might slant the presentation of a certain event. News values are forever evolving, and they're very much about the stories that are told and a little bit less about the events themselves. They tend to prioritize stories about events that are recent, that are sudden, that are unambiguous. It is difficult to write, to tell a news story about an event that is complex, that has many layers. They also prioritize stories about events that are predictable, that are relevant to us or to the closest, the most proximate culture, class, location. Priority is given to stories about the economy, government, politics, industry and business, foreign affairs, and domestic affairs. Um, Emphasis is placed on conflict. Conflict sells, human interest as well, that sells as well. Let's not forget that news is also, and most importantly, a business. Priority is given to elite nations, elite people. News values often involve appeals to dominant ideologies and discourses. And lastly, news stories need to appeal to readers, viewers, listeners. So they must be commonsensical, okay, not too complicated. That's how the story goes. Entertaining and dramatic, kind of like fiction, and also very visual. So depending on what medium you tune into, you will hear a different story. And this is not a new trend. This has been happening for a long time. This is part and parcel of how news has always worked. Let me tell you a story to illustrate that. So in the previous century, again, in the 1950s, here in Chicago, a couple of political scientists, the Langs, decided to conduct an experiment. They wanted to understand how television viewing, which was becoming popular at the time, skewed the presentation of reality. So they picked a certain day. They picked the day for which General MacArthur was supposed to come to Chicago, and there was a parade organized to celebrate his arrival. The parade had been carefully planned. There were a lot of people participating in the streets. So, what the Langs did is they interviewed people who were out in the streets participating in the parade. And then they also went and interviewed people who were watching from home, from the comfort of their living rooms and TV sets. And they compared the experiences of these two groups. And they found, oddly, that people who were out in the streets thought that the parade was a rather impersonal event. They found the general to be very distant, and they thought the parade was disorganized. They didn't really enjoy it a whole lot. On the other hand, people who watched the event, who observed the event from home, from TV, it was almost like they were looking at a different reality. They reported that the general appeared to be very personable and warm. The event felt very organized, celebratory. They enjoyed it. Um, this is both an old story and a new story because those of us who study the news and how news stories are told across different platforms, we see that playing out over and over again. Okay, just think about or just compare on your TV screens how one story plays on CNN versus MSNBC versus Fox News. Look at how one channel or one medium covers how the state of Illinois is dealing with the COVID crisis, and then tune in to a different medium and see what kind of coverage you get there. It feels like you're looking at a different reality. And I know that when I'm using the term alternate realities at this point in time, I know that this is resonating with many of you. So what does this mean for the impact of news on how we view the world? Well, here's the thing. Much behavioral science, and when I say much behavioral science, really excessive amounts of behavioral science helps us understand with a lot of nuance the place of social and news media in our everyday lives. When it comes to how we converse, how we form attitudes, how these attitudes turn into beliefs and behaviors, we know that social media, that news media, we know what they do and what they do not do. They do not tell us what to do, but they do tell us what to think about, what issues to prioritize. They prioritize things for us. They prioritize often based on distinctions that are formed around gender, class, race, ethnicity, relevance, proximity, and they did so pre-algorithms. Okay, so we tend to throw the term algorithms around, but we're forgetting that we have always used mechanisms for prioritizing our realities and the ways in which those realities are reported through the news. In the era of print media, radio, television, we call those news values, and I just talked about them. We connected them to ratings, and they give us ways to think about social media, news media, give us ways to think about key issues. They offer vocabulary, terms, syntax, grammar, tone. They frame. They offer a lens through which we view reality. It's a lens. It's not all of reality. It's a part of it. They set agendas. Okay, they establish an order we use in order through which we examine what's happening in the world around us. And they also tell stories. They often cast people as characters. They create, from CNN to Fox News to NPR, because they all need to attract eyeballs. They tell stories, they cast characters, they create drama. Everyone does this for ratings, for the economics of attention. Okay, let me switch gears. I'm going to get to news tips and then the healthy news diet. But before I do that, I wanted to take this opportunity and talk a little bit about what the internet will and will not offer you, because that does actually connect to your ability to curate your news feeds, to curate your news environments. So first, some things that underpin our understanding of technology, of democracy, of equality. The internet is not a magical space. It cannot create something out of nothing. It cannot create something that does not exist, cannot create democracy. It cannot also on its own destroy democracy. It opens up more paths to connection, so it pluralizes, but it does not democratize. Those paths do not always lead to democracy. It connects democratically oriented people, but also connects fascists. Nor does it amplify voice on equal terms, nor does it extinguish problems. It amplifies, but not on equal terms. Voices are amplified online. Not all voices are equal. The internet does not create hate speech. It's not responsible for it on its own, but it does make hate speech and toxicity more visible. It makes it more easily spreadable. And by the way, while I have your ear, let me just briefly talk about what these media do for your social lives, because I know that's a question that's going to come up. Do social media make you more or less social? They do neither. People use the internet to get more of what they do not have enough of in their everyday lives. I put real in parentheses because the kinds of experiences that you have online are with people, and they're therefore no less real or realistic than the experiences that you have offline. But what happens is that, for people who are extroverts, well, the internet, social media platforms, they afford more opportunities for connection and for balancing those connections and more opportunities for expression. And so it is easier for those people to balance their many social networks. For people who are shy, the internet offers a variety of different paths for connection. So it is easier for those people then to acclimate and find meaningful avenues for being sociable in ways that make them feel comfortable, make them feel happier. Um, but also keep in mind, that the internet is not some place you enter and then leave your baggage behind. When you enter the internet, you bring your baggage with you. You don't get to check it out on the way in. So online, you will see the same people that you see offline. You will see your mom. You will see those friends that you don't really want to see. You will see your ex, possibly, and you will likely see them all more often and in unexpected ways and places, because the internet and these platforms often collapse all your social spheres of connection, and they don't give you an easy way to separate them out. So it's not like your neighborhood where you can decide, you're going to go to this bar because your ex doesn't go there. That's not really going to happen as easily online. You're going to have to plan for it. So your baggage, whatever that is, a bad relationship or toxicity, it comes with you. It doesn't stay behind. Remember that. If it's there, toxic conversation, it's because we brought it with us. Also, the internet is not some exotic place. People use it for connection. They use it for expression. They use it also for mundane, everyday things. And finally, for those of you who are parents, education, parenting, peer groups are important. Your social spheres online are what you make them. And at last, before I get into these much advertised tips and the healthy news media diet, let's talk briefly about what social media do, what news media can and cannot do when it comes to election and when it comes to movements and social change. So, do social news media make or break elections? No, they do not tell us what to do. We're not automatons, but they tell us what to think about. They prioritize things for us, and they also tell us how to think about it. They give us vocabulary, and often they influence the tone of conversation. They may do things. They may use vocabulary that often amplifies the toxicity, the toxic elements present in conversation. Do social media make or break revolutions or movements or possibilities for social change on their own? No, but they do intensify movements because of the virality aspect, because of the speed with which information moves online. And in that sense, they do tend to enhance populism. They connect, but they also divide, and they enable acts of symbolic impact. And that is no small thing. And when I used to say, I think that, like 8 or 9 years ago, I used to explain it a lot. I used to say that, look, these media are not going to have an impact that's instant, that's political, that's economic, that's sociocultural. They're going to have a symbolic impact. They're important because they allow people to renegotiate key terms that have to do with their civil rights, and they allow them transitional access to power, a transitional opportunity to have a say. And it's those small opportunities, those small windows of change that then permit things to evolve, because we have to remember that change is gradual. Revolutions are long, and they have to be long in order to attain meaning. Now, when I say that they enable symbolic acts of symbolic impact, we have to understand that these acts of symbolic impact sometimes are going to alienate us and bother us, and sometimes they're going to make us feel much more comfortable. And I think you know what I mean, or you'll get what I mean when you think back on the mob, the crowds that stormed the Capitol building recently. And I know that for many of us, this was a terrifying act, because yes, for sure, it had the potential of being very violent and having even more casualties than we mourned. But more importantly, the symbolic impact of that act that was coordinated online was upsetting to many of us. And so, this is a way in which the illustration of the depth of the gravitas, a symbolic act of uh, can attain. Okay, so now that we talked about all the deep and heavy things, what to do with all the things that pop up on your screen in a daily basis? What do you want to ignore? And what do you want to pay attention to? Clickbait. It's mostly a headline and catchy one. And I know you've clicked on it and you've realized that it's just a headline and there's nothing below it. So you don't have to click on it. You can look at it if you want. If you go ahead and click on it, you're just feeding the algorithm the wrong information. Don't. Look if you must, avoid clicking. Listicles, those are the things that start with, 10 things you need to know about this, or 10 ways to improve your daily life. They typically tell you things that you already know. I'm not saying abstain from all listicles forever, but try again to be a little bit mindful, because these things work by remembering your choices. So the more inaccurate information, or just casually curated information you feed the machine, uh, the more unhappy you're going to be with the sort of search results that it gives you. What you need to know, that's another set of articles that have come up lately that just kind of tend to condense a very complex story to just a very simple list of like 10 things you need to know. Because remember, I told you news values are not very friendly to stories that are ambiguous, that have a lot of texture, a lot of layers to them. So what you need to know are not necessarily useless, but read them with a grain of salt. Uncredited material circulating on social media. Okay, so that, treat it the same way you're treating a piece of gossip that your neighbor shares with you over the fence. Partisan versus nonpartisan. And here we hear a lot of conversation about, I'm not listening to that because that's partisan. I'm going to take this point of view because it is nonpartisan. Spoiler alert, there is nothing that is not partisan. Everything has a point of view, everything has a bias, everything has noise attached to it. Best strategy is to learn to read that bias, ask where it's coming from, read it, and then take a moment to think about it and form your own opinion. Try to curate your feeds. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but it's not. A little goes a long way. Just that tiny decision to not click on that clickbait or on that listicle is, if you do a little bit of that every day, I feel like I'm sounding like like one of those consultants who's telling you what to eat so that you eventually end up living a healthier life. A little bit a day goes a long way. It's true, though, those smart decisions, small as they may be every day, end up preparing and curating a news infoscape that we're going to end up enjoying a little bit more. Click wisely, a little goes a long way again. Take some time to organize your feeds, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or other platforms that you use. If there's some people who are irritating you, mute them. If there's some people who you think are giving you valid information, elevate them. Change things up every once in a while. If you're the kind of person who likes to read different kinds of opinions, I do, for my job, and because that's how my brain works. I have a variety of different lists on Twitter that direct me to different kinds of news outlets, and I just navigate them depending on what I'm interested in reading. Also, by the way, I didn't put this on here, but really try to avoid doom scrolling, not just, on the internet, but in general. Doom scrolling can be a way of life. Just try to stay out of it and veer in an opposite direction. Um, Read, process, interpret, listen, and wait. These platforms uh, generate content because we create it, right? Because we fill those platforms with our opinions, with our feelings, with our pictures of what we ate, with the things that we share. Imagine what Twitter and Facebook would look like if we never posted anything. They would practically not exist. Our networks are only as lively as the information that flows through them. So make that information meaningful, and don't feel like you need to have an opinion about everything just because there's a Twitter prompt they're constantly asking you, or a Facebook prompt, how are you feeling today, or what are your thoughts on this. Of course we all have a right to an opinion, but think first, have I earned that right? Do I need to state that opinion, and do I need to state it to the world? Or is it okay to just kind of, turn around and say it to a family member or a friend who's next to me? Uh, Finally, what does a healthy news media diet look like? Try to read across the board and spectrum, diversify. It's kind of like, you really need to think of this like food. I'm not suggesting, it's a lot like a regular diet. I'm not suggesting that you throw out junk food entirely. Nobody's saying that. Just don't eat it all the time. Think what would happen to your body if you ate chocolate 24/7. Not very good things. Same thing here. You need to just sort of balance it out so you're getting a little bit of everything. And at the end of the day, you're looking at a news infoscape that's allowing you to examine. You're looking at a news infoscape that's as diverse as the world that we live in. Read on serious things, but also read fun things, diversify. Just don't read only serious or only fun. Read fast, okay? It's okay to speed read, but then take some time to think about what you read. I think it's equally important. I think we often do the opposite. We might take longer to read, and then we think about things very quickly, and then we also take quick action. So reverse that trend. Read fast, think slow. Game the system. So, click carefully, click wisely, feed that algorithm the information that you want it to get. Train it in the same way that you're training a pet. Take agency, take control over that algorithm. And change begins with you, your gaze. In an age of the economics, in the age of the economics of attention, your gaze is your most powerful weapon, is a powerful force. Your clicks matter. Use them to make a difference. Now, I do have a few more things to say, but I'm going to pause here and then open it up for questions. And just remind everyone of what I like to say, and I frequently end my talks with this: technologies network us, but it is our stories, the stories that we tell through these technologies, that connect us, that identify us, and that also potentially divide us. Thank you.
Thank you. What a wonderful conversation. And I love how you presented that, news is telling a story, and just for us to think about that way, and also for us to go on a media diet, because I think it's always healthy to walk away from social media every once in a while and to gain perspective. We've had a couple of questions that come in, and certainly encourage other questions to come in the chat if there are questions. Let me start with a pre-question that was sent to us, which is, should channels such as CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, etc., be regulated so any information they present that is editorial is separated by a disclaimer versus news that is free of bias?
There is no news that is free of bias. I think that's something that we have to accept. As long as we have an individual telling a story, there's going to be a little bit of trace, uh, a little bit of a trace of bias in there. I think we need to make a distinction between editorial and inaccurate. And I think here I need to talk a little bit about the truth, because really ultimately what you're asking me here is a question about the truth. And that's the last part that I wanted to talk about in that last slide. And I cut it because I didn't want us to run out of time, and I wanted to have some time for conversation. So I'm very glad to the person who asked me this particular question. Essentially what you're asking me is what to do about misinformation, um, what to do about toxicity, what to do about the inability to trust the media. Um, Understand that none of this is new. We've always had a problematic relationship with news media. Bias has always been present in the way in which news media operate and tell stories. All of this has happened before, and we can learn from the past. We can learn valuable lessons from the past. Now, you're probably asking, this is all great, Zizi, but um, where can I find the truth? Where did it go? And the answer for that, the answer to that I have is, um, even if you do find the truth, you might not end up liking it so much. Uh, um, I've been thinking more and more lately that the truth perhaps might not be enough. We often seek the truth and expect the truth from our news media, and I think we don't get it, and that's part of the reason why we become disillusioned. I did my first study on civility and toxicity and misinformation in the late 90s. At that time, I looked at discussion boards. So this was before the web was platformized. I encountered misinformation and disinformation and prejudice and bias and what you might call editorial back then. And then re-encountered all of that in follow-up studies that I did on other media. Um, these things are not new. We've always lived with propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. They have always been differently disseminated, but they have always been there. We can develop antibodies for misinformation, and I've been giving you advice on how to do that. We could try to regulate, but those solutions are going to be imperfect. They're not going to solve the problem entirely. And here's why. We're looking for the truth. The truth is contextually articulated. The vocabulary, the grammar, the syntax of truth is specific to a culture, to a locale. Much of our research on misinformation and developing defense mechanisms for it suggests that the truth is no longer enough. Not only has the infrastructure of truth been tampered with significantly over the past few years, but you have to understand that more than anything, and this is the key point I want to make, the truth is a mechanism for belonging. Okay, regardless of evidence and curation and regulation, people may choose the truths that they feel comfortable belonging to. And it's not just, people like you or not that I'm referring to. We all do this in our everyday lives, in our relationships. There are truths that we choose to see and other truths that we choose to ignore. This is not new. We all do this more or less in our everyday lives. So I think that more important than regulating the truth is to understand what the truth means to each and every one of us, and to just ready ourselves to confront it, and to also understand, be aware of, have sort of body mechanisms that are triggered when we're too prone to ignoring it.
It's really interesting. It could be probably a whole nother session just talking about how we hear things and how we disseminate information and just what is the truth and what we want to believe. I think that was
Mm.
very impactful. Thank you for sharing that. Another question that I think might follow up well, which is, has the pandemic exposed any new cracks in the media landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this connects to what I was saying. It's very easy. The news media have an easy time telling stories that are unambiguous. The pandemic is a very ambiguous story filled with ambivalence. First of all, science, the science of epidemiology is about planning for contingencies. There's nothing more complex. There's very few things that are more complex and unpredictable than an epidemic and a pandemic. And we're, in a situation where we're asking news media that have been trained or and are accustomed and basically function based on telling stories, cranking out stories that are meant to serve up unambiguous, undisputed information, to tell the story of a pandemic that has surprised us every single day. And the truth is that, that's the way pandemics work. Epidemiologists understand this, but have a really hard time explaining it to journalists. And then, even if journalists understand it, well, the structure of news is simply not cut out to present a story that is as layered as the story of a pandemic. So we end up describing things in very simplistic terms that misinform, that create, the illusion or the impression of editorialism. Sometimes what comes across as editorialism is often a way of like oversimplifying an issue that's very, very, very complex. Editorial often means choosing to see just one side of the story when in fact there are many, many different aspects to that story. And the story of the COVID pandemic has so many different subtexts to it that we have not even, our daily news has not even begun to focus on. All that we look at is, cure and vaccine. That's most of what's covered, and that's covered in a very superficial manner.
But it's so multifaceted. It'll be interested
Mm.
to see history books how things are written.
Well,
I have two more questions, which are quite different. The first one is, how has the former president's ban from social media impacted the news landscape? The person continues to say, should all politicians be banned? Um,
um, that's such a fascinating question. Oh God, first of all, I should say that, I don't know if all politicians should be banned. I will tell you that, most politicians do not know and have not known what to do with the internet or with social media platforms for a long time. And many of them are actually not really very sure what to do with television either. A mediated presence is a very complicated thing for a politician. I write in my most recent book that in order to come across as being authentic, the person has to play a character. And it's true. Think about it. I mean, if you appear as you are on television with no makeup, with nothing, you end up looking quite scary, right? It's a very distorted picture. So you have to play a part in order to look authentic. And much of that also happens on social media. You have to choose how to perform yourself and which part of yourself to perform so that there are people who are listening to you and who are connecting with you actually get the feeling that they're speaking to a human. Um, it, at times, it feels like we're expecting too much of our politicians. We're asking them to have all of the attributes of a very gifted CEO, to know something about, to know a lot about everything, uh, and then at the same time to be very gifted entertainers on TV. The fascinating thing about President Trump is that he managed to use social media and Twitter in particular in a way that benefited his own image tremendously. And he did so, on a medium where everybody else had failed. Now, does this mean that we ban all politicians from Twitter? Um, and I think we're misunderstanding or mispresenting the issue when we look at that as a ban. Um, Twitter is a private company. At some point, they specified a specific code of conduct. They laid out specific consequences if that code of conduct was violated. And then as a result, they were they went ahead and implemented that code of conduct. Am I cynical about their timing in terms of, when they implemented that code of conduct? Of course, they they only felt that it was time to do it when it really seems like, President Trump was practically out of office. Am I cynical about how the media covered President Trump? Of course I am. Before he was elected, they covered every single thing that he said on Twitter, often ignoring important issues and generating the myth, helping amplify the myth that became President Trump. So again, it's one of those issues that is multifaceted. I can be discussing forever. I will tell you that there's a number of us professors who study journalism who have been encouraging journalists to cover President Trump in a different way and not to focus so much on his presence on Twitter. I think that had they done so, we would not have gone down the path of having to examine whether he needed to be booted from social media or not. And then I will just leave it at that because it's a really lengthy, complex conversation. That it's not like a yes or no answer, kick them all out or keep them in. It really is just a multi-stage process that we need to look at and examine and discuss. But it's a conversation that I look forward to having with anyone at any time. And I would enjoy having it.
No, well, thank you. And it kind of comes full circle to your point early on about polls, that it's not yes and no answers. It's very complicated, particularly with this particular. I know I gave you a strong question for the end, so thank you for that response. And we are going to go ahead and put in the chat in case you want to hear more thoughts or read more thoughts, I should say, about your book, which I believe you said is called After Democracy.
After Democracy, Imagining Our Political Future.
Wonderful. Well, I encourage all of you to check it out. And thank you so much, Professor Papakarisi, for this time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All your knowledge with us. We really, really appreciate it. Just to close this out really quickly, please join us tomorrow on Thursday, March 11th at noon Central Standard Time for our next alumni exchange event. We'll be joined by two UIC faculty experts who will present what does defund the police for schools mean in this interactive discussion, talking about how policing happens in schools and what a police-free school environment could look like. To find a recording of this session and all of our sessions, please go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, the recording will be listed there too. Also, please be on the lookout for that quick survey I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you again, Professor Papakarisi, and to all of you for joining us.
Thank you all for taking the time to listen and I wish we had time to talk more. Take good care.
Us too. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a great day, and everybody. Look forward to seeing you in a future alumni exchange.